Hello, my name is Marlene, and I'd like to welcome you to Vegan Nation. You tuned in to WCUW 91.3 FM, Worcester Community Radio, serving Central Massachusetts and worldwide at WCUW.org.
Vegan Nation is sponsored in part by St. Croix Beach Massage, advocating social justice for all living creatures. Massage on the beach, at your rental villa, or at the historic Club Comanche Hotel St. Croix, because your tropical vacation should be filled with relaxation. Online at massagestcroix.com.
The views in this program do not necessarily reflect the views of this station nor its management. Welcome to Vegan Nation. I'm your host, Marlene. Vegan Nation is an informational program about living the vegan lifestyle, featuring interviews with individuals and organizations who are practicing a healthy vegan lifestyle. Thank you for joining us on Vegan Nation. We're very fortunate to be joined by Shelley Harrison, a vegan author and also a lawyer and law teacher. Welcome, Shell, and thank you for joining us on Vegan Nation.
Thank you, Marlene. I'm always so glad to get to talk to you, and looking forward to talking about a vegan Christmas Carol today.
Yes. Let's hear about that. How to Veganize a Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Let's hear a little bit about that process and also the story of the book as well.
So, A Vegan Christmas Carol is the full text of Charles Dickens' famous 1843 A Christmas Carol, with the difference being that those portions of the text that include animal exploitation or dead body parts being treated as food, those parts of the text have been veganized.
Wow. So why veganize a classic work?
We would veganize a work, and that could be a short story or a novel, a screenplay for a film, or a script for a live theater performance stage. We veganize such works for the exact same reasons why we veganize other aspects of our lives. So we don't want to engage in cruelty and violence ourselves. We don't want to pay other people to do so, of course, on our behalf. And by the same token, we don't want to legitimize and condone and grace, really that might be the term, grace cruelty and violence with our attention and with our attendance at an event such as a film or a stage production. Yeah, so for instance, you wouldn't build your own Christmas dinner around the rotting corpse of a torture victim, and you wouldn't go to your next-door neighbor's house and do that. So why would you go to Bob Cratchit's house? Bob Cratchit, of course, is a character in A Christmas Carol. And why would you go to Bob Cratchit's house to do this very thing that you would find to be so repulsive and so on in your own daily life? You wouldn't do that, and it doesn't make any sense to go do such a thing just in the context of a fictional or fantasy work.
Yes, indeed. And why veganize this particular work first?
Well, so A Christmas Carol is such a central feature of the way that we modernly celebrate Christmas. It's a perennial, it's a classic, and it's so influential. In terms of longer form works that are as deeply embedded in the Christmas season as A Christmas Carol, probably the only one that comes to mind that comes around with as much being part of the standard of the holiday would be The Nutcracker by Tchaikovsky. And of course that's a dance and a music-related production, but in terms of live performances anyway, A Christmas Carol and then The Nutcracker would probably be the two most commonly performed longer form works during the season. And, putting up a production of The Nutcracker requires a whole bunch of resources in terms of the musicians and dancers and that kind of thing, whereas A Christmas Carol can be put up pretty much at any level of society. So you'll have elementary school productions of A Christmas Carol, you'll have high school or community productions and professional productions and that kind of thing. So it's even more commonly performed than The Nutcracker. And then over in film, in terms of the longer form works, probably the only comparable piece would be It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart. And that, of course, is another classic that is very dependably installed into the Christmas tradition. But in that case, even It's a Wonderful Life is a sort of downstream influence of Dickens' A Christmas Carol. The person who wrote the short story on which It's a Wonderful Life is based expressly mentioned that he had been influenced by A Christmas Carol. Of course, there are a couple other films like the Bing Crosby films that come around, White Christmas, A Holiday Inn. But other than that, A Christmas Carol and It's a Wonderful Life are probably the two most common films out there. And so it's a central piece. Well, and by the way, when I say A Christmas Carol being a film, it's been made into so many different versions. I mean, there's not only the straight productions like with George C. Scott from 30 years ago, or the Jim Carrey version that came out a few years ago, which is so nice, but it's also been made, into various adaptations like the Muppet Christmas Carol or the Barbie Christmas Carol and that kind of thing. So it's a very influential work. It's just central to how the season gets celebrated these days. And so that's a good reason why we would veganize this particular work.
We're listening to Shelley Harrison, author, lawyer, and law teacher. And Shell, I'd like to ask you a couple questions next. First, if you could give us a little synopsis of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, published in 1843, and then give us some of the examples of how you have veganized it.
So the story, A Christmas Carol, is the story of a greedy business person named Ebenezer Scrooge who doesn't like Christmas. And people try to get him to join their Christmas celebrations or to donate to the poor, for instance, in honor of the holiday season, and he very forcefully says no. Then on Christmas Eve, Scrooge is visited by a series of ghosts. They show him various scenes from his own life and Christmases in his own past, and then some scenes from the present-day lives of others celebrating Christmas, and then finally a glimpse of what the future could look like. And he's kind of shocked by this confrontation with his own mistakes he's made in the past and his kind of blindness to other people. As a result of that shock, he undergoes a profound personal transformation and also kind of, at least partly, kind of redeems himself from his years of having been so unavailable to his fellow creatures. And then by the end of the story, he's very much of a different person. He's generous and kind and benevolent, and he vows to keep the spirit of generosity and kindness that's associated with Christmas in his heart all year long. So that'd be the kind of synopsis. And then what was the second part of your question there?
Some of the examples of how you've veganized it, but where does the story take place?
The story is in London in 1840s. He wrote it in 1843, and so it's just set right there in London.
Okay. And how did you veganize it?
So if you see a stage production, and I generally, when I'm thinking about A Christmas Carol, I absolutely love the book, of course, but we'll generally think of it in terms of the theatrical adaptations. But if you do see a theatrical performance, and particularly one by a professional theater company that has enough resources to put into the prop department, one of the most magnificent scenes in the show and most memorable scenes is going to be the entrance of the ghost of Christmas Present. So you might recall that is the ghost who comes in on a big throne of food. And that's actually the word that is used in the text of the book. So the ghost of Christmas Present, who has influences, in his appearance that kind of invoke some of the traditions that have gone into, say, Father Christmas and that kind of thing. He comes in on this throne, but of course, in the throne of food are a number of dead bodies. So obviously that's going to be something that we want to veganize. And so in veganizing the throne, it's easy to just grab material, and this is going to be an important part of the veganizing process in general. Grab material directly from other portions of the book itself. So there's plenty of great vegan food already built into Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And so what happened here is just grabbing that great vegan food from other portions of the book, such as Fezziwig's Christmas Party or something like that, and then moving those things into the throne of the Ghost of Christmas Present. And anytime that we're doing that veganizing process, we're going to want to make sure that we stay away from any anachronisms. So we wouldn't want to introduce, say, tofurkey into the throne. I love tofurkey and glad it's out there. It just didn't exist in 1843, and it would undermine the aesthetic quality, and that's really our touchstone here. It would undermine the aesthetic quality of the book, and it would kind of break the fourth wall to be introducing any kinds of anachronisms there, both in terms of time, but also in terms of place. So that's one example that's relatively straightforward because it deals with food. Another example would be there's a reference in the first portion of the book to a coach and six. Scrooge is walking up his staircase, and it says broad enough to drive a coach and six up the staircase. But what does that mean? A coach and six is a stagecoach that is drawn by six horses. So again, here, this is a little more subtle because it's not just food and it's not dead bodies being explicitly depicted, but it's still going to need to be veganized there. So in this case, we'd want to use a vehicle if we can, because a stagecoach and six horses is a vehicle, but we'd want to veganize that. And so what was done there is the coach and six image was switched out with a steam engine. And Dickens had traveled to the U.S. in 1842 by steamboat, so he would have been very aware of steam engines, of course, at that time, and of course railroads. So steam was being used to power vehicles both on land and sea by then. So it's a natural comparison. It preserves the vehicle, and again preserves the time and place and so on. And so it serves the literary work well, and nobody ever even would notice or know that had been veganized.
Wonderful. We're listening to Shelley Harrison, a vegan author, lawyer, and law teacher. And Shell has recently veganized the classic, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. This is Vegan Nation. I'm your host, Marlene Narrow. We'll be taking a short break, and then we'll continue our conversation with Shelley Harrison, and we'll be discussing the veganizing process, what principles are used, vegan literary theory, and the power of fiction to produce real-world results.
This is WCUW Worcester 91.3 FM Community Radio Service, Central Massachusetts.
This is Victor Wainwright, and won't you consider making a tax-deductible donation to your community radio? Your donation will keep your favorite program alive on WCUW, and we thank you.
I know that you're smart.
You're tuned in to Vegan Nation. I'm your host, Marlene, in Massachusetts. I'd like to thank all our listeners for tuning in. We're joined by vegan author Shelley Harrison. Now here's a little musical interlude. Be kind already.
You see yourself as a beacon of virtue. What if some stranger decided to hurt you like you hurt him? Would it be a sin?
What will it take to crush your denial? When will you see he's just a child? It's not his fate to fill your plate. Be kind already. Let go of your pride already. Listen to the cries already, and open your heart. Enough already. I'm losing my mind already. Protesting's a grind already. I know that you're smart. Be kind, be kind, be kind. Baby, be kind. Just be kind, just be kind.
You think I'm just out to make trouble as you fight like hell to stay in your bubble.
But you will see that history's on my side.
Just be kind, be kind, just be kind. Just be kind. Just
Welcome back from the break. This is Vegan Nation. I'm your host, Marlene. We're very fortunate to be joined by author, lawyer, and law teacher Shelley Harrison. Thanks again, Shell, for joining us on Vegan Nation.
Thank you, Marlene.
This is great. I'm really happy to hear about A Vegan Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens and veganized by S.E. Harrison. So, Shell, let's start with talking about the veganizing process. What is that like?
Veganizing the work, of course, the first thing you're going to want to do is, or the thing you're going to want to keep in mind is the aesthetic quality of the work. So a classic becomes a classic because it has that literary merit. And so that's always going to be our touchstone when we are veganizing a piece. And then what you would do is, and I would encourage everyone to do so, to participate in this process and new movement, study the text that you're working with and that given author, and then the context in which it was written, so that you can be in a position to do a good job of replacing those items that need to be replaced. So, for instance, you would not want to be introducing any anachronisms, like we talked about earlier, something that's out of time or out of place. You'd want to preserve the author's voice and their kind of way of phrasing things and their style. You'd want to preserve the quality of the work, of course, and so that's where things like the poetics that we mentioned earlier, and of course you'd want to retain the meaning and the function of the given passage in the story as a whole. So those are the kind of, I guess you'd say, kind of touchstone principles that would be used, and then the process itself is going to just be one of going in there and identifying all the things that would need veganizing, and that's going to be some very explicit ones, such as the dead bodies in the Christmas present, and the ghost of Christmas present, his throne. That's going to be obvious, and then there's going to be some more nuanced portions that will also need to be veganized, but you may not necessarily recognize them as easily right away, so you'll just have to be patient.
Thank you. And Shell, can you tell us a little bit about vegan literary theory and criticism?
In literary criticism generally, and I kind of was just alluding to this, but kind of drilling down on that topic, in literary criticism, we are looking into the aesthetic qualities of a given literary work or body of works, and ultimately evaluating a given work's performance on its aesthetic and literary merit. And there are other dimensions that you can consider and may be considered, such as the biographical details of the author's life or the social details of the context in which the work was originally written. But ultimately, it's that purely aesthetic caliber of the work that is, in my view, the essential focus of literary criticism. Now, when we're talking about vegan literary criticism, all we're doing is taking the blinders off, if you will. So vegan literary theory retains the exact same focus of literary criticism on aesthetic value, but in vegan literary theory, we pursue that focus such that all the living beings, all the animals, not just the humans in the story, are recognized as having character rather than merely being props or symbols for use in the story. So instead of just being objects that the characters, i.e. humans, manipulate, the animals are themselves characters, and their personalities, their personal incentives and motivations, their stakes in the given story, and their relationships to one another are going to be fully alive and fully in view of the vegan literary critic. And whereas in a sort of pre-vegan literary theory, those animals would just be, again, objects like rocks or robots or what have you. So what does that give us when we go to vegan literary theory as opposed to just pre-vegan literary theory? Well, it gives us this, and the analogy that I would use would be, if you are a scientist or an analyst of pretty much any underlying subject matter, you would always prefer to see more and to have better information and better perception. So rather than just kind of being blind to certain aspects of your data. So you'd rather have a better telescope or a better microscope so that you can have better information. And that's what's happening in vegan literary theory, is that we are simply accounting for the creatures and the motivations and the characters that in a pre-vegan context are simply, discounted. They're just invisible. And I guess on that note, I would say that there is a prominent literary critic out there who says that literary criticism is the sort of wisdom literature of our age. And if that is true, then vegan literary theory and criticism represents an upgrade to the wisdom literature and a sort of advance for the whole field. It's an upgrade to the wisdom of that wisdom literature.
Beautiful. And Shell, what do you think about the power of fiction to produce real-world results?
Well, in that consideration, I would bring up two cases in mind. One is a sort of ancient case, and then one is a relatively modern case. And the ancient case would be the Iliad. So the Iliad, of course, is a document that was written down by Homer. We don't know exactly who Homer was, but a person or persons named Homer puts down in writing for the first time this story, which had probably been honed for decades and centuries, and included many other stories into it in an oral tradition, and then finally got written down by this person, Homer. And the ethos of classical and golden age Greece is very much embodied and empowered through this work of literature, the Iliad, and you can see its influence underlying many of those amazing events of classical Greece. Well, you fast forward all the way down to the beginning of the Hellenistic era and Alexander the Great. Who's Alexander the Great? Well, he's a Macedonian king, and he wound up conquering most of what was the largest empire at that time, the Persian Empire. And what is said to have been under his pillow at night? A copy of the Iliad. Now, that wouldn't be literally possible from what I understand, because the Iliad would have taken up way too much papyrus for anybody to actually sleep on it comfortably anyway. But it would definitely be, at the metaphorical level, it definitely was true, because that's how central the Iliad was to not only the general ethos of the Greek culture at that time, but to the particular mindset of this person. And his real world impact, of course, cannot be denied, having created this gigantic empire that gave rise to the Hellenistic age. So there's a good example from ancient history of the impact that a work of fiction and literature can have. And then the modern example that I would use would be Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852, 1853 or so. A few years after that, of course, the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, was elected, and as a result of that election, the Democrats led a secession movement, and then there was a war that went from 1861 to 1865, and more than 200,000 uniformed U.S. soldiers were killed during that time period. Obviously, we would treat that as a real-world event and had real-world implications, including, of course, the ending of human slavery. Well, Abraham Lincoln is said to have said, now again, this could just be apocryphal, but he is said to have said that Harriet Beecher Stowe was the little lady who started this big war. Well, why would he say that? Well, because Uncle Tom's Cabin was something that she had intentionally written as a way to galvanize, and indeed it did so, galvanize the anti-slavery movement. It was, in many ways, the first American blockbuster in terms of novels. It was the first blockbuster. Now, it's not viewed as highly now, because some of the literary conventions and so on that it uses appear, melodramatic to us in our day and age. But at the time, it absolutely sold off the shelves, and it was recognized at the time as having been a coalescing force for the anti-slavery movement in the U.S. that eventually did, of course, have very dramatic real-world effects. So there's a good example from the modern era of the impact that fiction can have.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Shell. I want to say that I like the cover of the book. And what was written in the red little sachet thing? Did it say, it said number 1 in the Christmas series, or what did it say up the top on the cover?
Oh, it says that it's the first volume in the Veganized Classic series. So
yes, Shell, and I believe that your work of the Vegan Christmas Carol will also be a great influence in the abolition of all slavery. I also like the cover of the book, The Vegan Christmas Carol, by Charles Dickens and veganized by Shelley Harrison. And also that is the first in the Veganized Classic series. Can you tell us about that?
yes, so this work, of course, is completed now and is in the form of A Vegan Christmas Carol, which again is just the original text of Charles Dickens' 1843 novel, but now veganized. And that is intended to be the first volume of what will eventually be a sort of vegan literary classics library. I have begun work on now Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and then H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. So those are 3 other kind of classics in their respective genres and so on that are in the works, and hopefully over time here we will have a full veganized classics series, and that will allow people to not have to condone it anymore, not have to condone the violence in a fictional setting that they wouldn't condone in real life. And if it's done properly, of course, then no one will ever even be able to tell that a given work has been veganized. And that's kind of the point, is just allow us to retain these great works. They're great for a reason. They're classic for a reason. They've earned their way into the canon or the curriculum of our culture. And so we want to hang on to those, but we also want to kind of, keep the good while getting rid of the things that we just don't need anymore.
Right, because I know that we are in the midst of a global transformation of a paradigm of normalized violence into the new paradigm of normalized nonviolence. And so speaking of that, I remember on the back of the book, the back cover of the book, it had the website www.vegan.christmas, and it was for information on how others can follow the process of veganizing classics in literature. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Sure. So some of the principles that I've mentioned here on the call, and then some of the examples that were given, are things that I have covered in a little blog regarding the veganizing process for this particular work. And so if somebody's interested in that, they're welcome to go to that website, of course, and just see for themselves.
That's very generous of you. Thank you, Shell. And what contact information can you share with our listeners for those interested in a vegan Christmas carol, as well as the literary process of veganizing the classics?
So just the URL. The URL is just vegan.christmas. Just find that would be the easiest way to follow this project.
Well, that's great, and that's easy to remember, vegan.christmas.
Yes.
Yes. And Shell, we're coming to a close in the interview. Do you have any other additional messages that you'd like to leave with our listeners?
Oh, well, I'm just very excited to have been on the call today, and that would be my main message. I've enjoyed it here, and that I hope that everyone can enjoy both a vegan Christmas carol, but also, even more importantly, it's really just to get the ball rolling there in this field of vegan literary criticism and the field of veganizing these classics, to kind of upgrade them to the modern era.
Thank you, Shelley Harrison.
Thank you, Marlene.
And thank you very much for joining us on Vegan Nation. The piano instrumentals is by Will Tuttle, The Turkey Song. I'd also like to thank Keith Berger, a vegan activist in Florida, for the instrumentals of guitar. And also Jane Unchained, and the vegan activist featured in the music Be Kind Already, sung by Jason Oliver and Michelle Swan. You're tuned in to Vegan Nation, broadcasting on WCUW 91.3 FM every Thursday, 4 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Vegan Nation is sponsored in part by St. Croix Beach Massage, advocating for social justice for all living creatures. Massage on the beach, at your rental villa, and at the historic Club Comanche Hotel. Online at massagestcroix.com. We'll be closing this episode of Vegan Nation with a special song by iChalk in Germany. Thanks for tuning in. So here's a special song by iChalk. That's spelled small case I, capital C-H-O-C. iChalk Vegan Chocolate Company in Germany with We Wish You a Vegan Christmas.
We wish you a vegan Christmas. We wish you a vegan Christmas. We wish you a vegan Christmas in the dairy-free air. We wish you a vegan Christmas. We wish you a vegan Christmas. We wish you a vegan Christmas in the dairy